Hello, all. Hope you're all doing well and staying healthy. Okay, we're going to talk about some more about Chapter 9, Part 2. In this lecture, we're talking about social facilitation, social loafing, and de-individuation. Some really interesting stuff. How this is really talking about or thinking about how our social groups influence our behavior as individuals. So social facilitation is when the presence of others energizes us or slows us down, which depends on whether we're doing something hard or easy. So we're gonna discuss that in detail. We will also talk about social loafing, which you guys know what that is, when the presence of others relaxes us, right, and we slack off. And thirdly, we're going to talk about de-individuation, which is it's really interesting mob mentality or the loss of self-awareness, which can result in really, really deviant behavior, terrible things, mob lynchings, things that occur quite often. And it doesn't necessarily have to be evil things. It can also be just really crazy, whatever the group norm is. It can be at concerts, you'll see this as well. So we'll talk about all those things in detail. But first, let's start with social facilitation. Social facilitation, again, the tendency for people to do better on simple tasks when they're around others, but worse on complex tasks when they're around others. So this has to do with whether or not other people can see what you're doing, whether your individual performance can be evaluated, okay? So Norman Triplett was a researcher way back in 1898 who noticed that cyclists race faster when they were racing with others. And so he designed one of the first social experiments where he had children reeling in fishing line, and he had them do it alone, and he also had them do it in groups of 3. And he found that when they were in groups of 3, they reeled the fishing line in faster, interestingly enough. And so we've seen this repeated in a lot of experiments. One of the most famous ones, Robert Zajonc, 1969, this is an animal study where he actually showed this effect in research with cockroaches, right? So he showed social facilitation with cockroaches. He designed 2 mazes for cockroaches. In the way that this worked, roaches will run away from light. So in the simple maze, he had the roaches, he shined a floodlight on the roaches, and they would run from one end to the other of this maze. Now he had what he called audience boxes, where he put other roaches who could observe, who were essentially being seen by the roach that was running through the maze. He called these audience boxes. And so he would have the roach run the maze, the simple maze, with and without roaches in the audience boxes. And he found when he did this in the simple maze that they would run even faster through the maze if they had other roaches watching them, or other roaches sitting in the audience boxes. And so he also showed that using a complex maze, that the other roaches, if they were there observing, would slow down the roach running through the maze because it was more complex. So he would shine the flashlight and the roach would start running from the light. But to get to his goal of the dark box, he would have to take a right turn. Well, he would do this much slower if there were other roaches watching than if he was alone. So it was a great example of social facilitation occurring even in roaches. All right, so and talk about why this might be occurring, or what we call social facilitation theory. And this is, again, Zajonc. He believed that this occurred because the presence of others increases arousal, which is basically anxiety. Think of it as anxiety. It's this physiological excitation. And when we are aroused or anxious about something, this increases the likelihood of whatever is the dominant response. So whatever response is the easiest or the most learned. So for the roaches, the simple maze was their easiest maze, was the learned response, the dominant response. When they tried to apply the dominant response in the more complex maze, it slowed them down because it was the wrong response. So that would be why the how this theory would work with the roaches. Marcus also did research looking at the social facilitation effect, and he did this with clothes, and he showed that if people are putting on familiar clothes in a group, they'll do it much faster in a group than if they are doing it alone. However, if they're putting on unfamiliar clothes, they do it much slower in a group than if they're doing it alone. So more interesting research just showing this whole effect of social facilitation. One more interesting example of this social facilitation was done in a field study where researchers studied pool players in a student center. So they observed the pool players from a distance, and they identified students who were expert pool players and who were novice pool players. And then they would walk up to the table and start watching so that the pool players knew that they were watching. So sure enough, they saw a social facilitation effect. The expert pool players actually improved from making 71% of their shots to making 80% of their shots, while the novice pool players actually declined. They were making 36% of their shots when they were not observed, but then their performance dropped to 25% when they were being observed. Okay, so how do we apply this knowledge to test taking? But the Ringelmann effect can be seen also in any sorts of group where there's a loss in group productivity when there is more people added to the group. Okay, so if you compare social facilitation to social loafing, as this cool chart does, you'll see that this is basically a way to see how the presence of others can either help us or hurt us as a group. So if you compare social facilitation to social loafing, in social facilitation, individual efforts are evaluated, can be evaluated. We have this alertness, we have this anxious because we're being evaluated, and this arousal enhances our performance on simple tasks and it impairs our performance on complex tasks. With social loafing, the individual efforts cannot be evaluated. We don't have any apprehension or anxiety because there's no evaluation apprehension. So we may relax. So this will impair our performance on simple tasks, but enhance our performance on complex tasks, right? So this is just a neat chart to kind of help you differentiate between these two types of group process effects, okay? Social loafing again. Who does more social loafing? Men more than women. And Western-oriented cultures, we see more social loafing than Eastern-oriented cultures. Again, why do we loaf? We can't identify individual efforts. They're not being rewarded as well, or the task is not challenging, appealing, or involving. Okay? So in terms of gender, who slacks off the most? Well, in a review of more than 150 studies, social loafing was definitely more likely among men. Why? Well, one theory is that women tend to be higher than men in relational interdependence. We know that to be true. So perhaps this higher incidence of relational interdependence makes women less likely to engage in social loafing when they're in groups. So that's one theory as why maybe women tend to be not as high as men on social loafing. Okay, Again, so if we think about it in terms of culture, the tendency to loaf is stronger in Western cultures than in Asian cultures. Again, this may be because in Asian cultures, there's a stronger emphasis on interdependency, or in thinking of ourselves in terms of interdependence. So it reduces social loafing because you're more concerned about being able to help other people. So how do we reduce social loafing? Well, one way we can do it is to take away the causes of social loafing in groups and organizations by identifying and rewarding individual effort and making the task more challenging, more appealing, and more involving for those in the group, right? So let's talk about de-individuation. So de-individuation is a loss of self-awareness and evaluation apprehension, which results in this uninhibited behavior. And this is getting caught up in the power of the situation. We see this at rock concerts. We see it with all different sorts of mobs. If you think about it, an actual definition, this is when there's a loosening of normal constraints on behavior. When people can't be differentiated, when they really are part of a crowd, become the crowd. And this leads to an increase in impulsive and deviant acts. De-individuation, again, then what causes it? Like we said, it's the anonymity. When people are in large groups, they're invisible in the crowd. Mullen, 1986, actually did this really interesting content analysis of 60 lynchings that were reported in the newspaper between 1899 and 1946. And he found that the more people there were in the mob, the greater the viciousness and the savageness of the mob in terms of how they killed their victims. So we also see that if there are costumes, that it contributes to the anonymity, the masks and the uniforms. This was replicated in research that Zimbardo did in 1970, where he found the participants, when they were in sheets and hoods, held a shock lever twice as long as those who wore name tags, right, instead of the costume. Okay, reinforcing this whole notion of anonymity. There's a picture there of Zimbardo's participants. And to show the dress for the experiment. So again, why does de-individuation lead to impulsive and sometimes violent acts? Well, people feel less accountable, and people are more likely to obey the group norms. And this can be if the group norms are positive, like dancing wildly, or negative, like attacking an individual, such as in a lynching, right? So we see this today online. We see examples of de-individuation. People feel less inhibited on social media when it's anonymous. This causes a reduction in common civility. The phenomenon of the internet troll that's a really good modern example of de-individuation. So how can we combat this? Well, you see some websites trying to combat it by requiring people to create an ID or an account with an ID that then reduces people's anonymity, right? So that's it for talking about D. Thanks for watching, and our next lecture we'll finish up chapter 9 and finish our discussion of group processes.